about other stuff that we're doing here at the library if you're interested for adults. Right now we have our poetry contest going on. So if you're interested in writing poetry or just want to try it, you know, go ahead. It's not like you have to be a poet, you just have to write a poem, an original poem. March 15th is a deadline to get that poetry in, and we have a sheet up at the front desk that will have the rules for that if you're interested in that or know of anyone who's interested for that at all. Our book discussion this month is February 26th at 6:00 p.m. We've got a few books back there left to check out if you're interested in it. This is one book that has been banned in a lot of different places. It is a young adult book. It's called Out of Darkness. It's a tragic romance, kind of like Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but set in 1937 East Texas with the oil fields. So if you're interested in that, let the front desk know. We can grab a book for you to read before February 26th. It's a Monday at 6:00 p.m. is when we're discussing that book. We have a movie matinee, February 28th at 2:00 p.m. We are going to be watching The Holdovers starring Paul Giamatti. I've heard a lot about this lately. I think there's some Oscar nominations in this movie. It's basically about a private boarding school where one of the older teachers has to stay during Christmas break and take care of those kids that have nowhere else to go. So I hear it's a heartwarming story. That's February 28th at 2:00 p.m. So if you are interested, I mean, check it out no matter what, but we have Bridges and Canopy. Bridges is where you get your downloadable books, audiobooks, magazines, all free from the library. But if you have a device, you can get your stuff free from the library. We also have Canopy, which is movie streaming free from the library. So we've got movies, you just need a library card where you can stream those from the library. If you're not sure how to do it, Amy, our tech person, is doing a tech talk on how to do this. She's doing that February 29th at 2:30 p.m. She'll be talking about how to stream movies from the library and how to get books and audiobooks and magazines and things like that from the library, all for free. We're going to have a reading challenge. This is on Beanstack. So Beanstack is an app, so it's an online reading challenge. It's just to keep you reading, push you and challenge you to keep reading every day. But it's called Read Across America, March 1st through the 31st, our monthly challenge. We are finishing up our winter read challenge. If you've noticed the case with all that fun stuff in there, those are prizes for the winter read challenge that you could win. If you finish the challenge, you get an entry to win those prizes. So the Read Across America will not have prizes until we get to the summer reading challenge, and then we'll have lots of cool prizes for adults. So next month we have Discover the World of Farming series. A lot of us were sitting around and figuring out that although we live in an area with fields everywhere, I know nothing about farming. And there's a lot of people that really don't know a lot about farming, or maybe they lived on a farm when they're younger and things have changed, things have modernized. So if you're interested to know about farming, we have a series going on starting March 6th. Every Wednesday at 2:00 p.m. we're going to have local farmers coming in and talking about different subjects. So the first one is March 6th at 2:00 p.m. and it's going to be planting and spraying, and it's Leo Steffes and Tyler Tessum that are going to be here talking about that. But they're going to be going through, every Wednesday, they're going to be going through a whole selection of different subjects. And they encourage questions, and even if you have a question not on the subject, that's fine too. They'll answer it because they're farmers, they know what they're talking about, they're experts. So if you're interested in that, keep that in mind. We have our coffee and conversation every month with the Extension office here in town. Our next coffee is Thursday, March 21st at 2:00 p.m. And we have some people coming in to talk about brain health resources. So if you're interested in knowing about brain health, how to get some resources to help you out with that type of thing, they will be here. We're going to have a casual conversation. with coffee and treats and just sitting down and talking about it. March 21st at 2 o'clock p.m. Next month, March 25th at 1 o'clock p.m., we are having an author talk, an Iowa author talk. She's going to come in. She's written 2 books so far, The Journey of Carolyn Olson, which is mainly what she's going to talk about, and we're going to have copies here that you can check out and read before she talks about it. But it's basically a historical fiction novel, and it is about, actually based on her great-great-grandparents who were immigrants from Norway to Iowa. So the story is going to be about a woman who loses her husband, but she also has other children, that has to take the body of her husband back to another city in Iowa. Of course, it's a while ago, so she is with horse and wagon while she's trying to do this trick. Anyways, if you're interested in that, we will have books to check out. March 25th at 1 o'clock p.m. All right, so we have a lot going on in the library, and we have a fun and exciting talk for you today. I want to first say thank you, SMU, for coming here and taping this. This is wonderful. Not only can we have you guys take a look at this, but other people that couldn't come today are going to be able to view it later on. We have Mark Anderson here. He is the archaeologist for the Sanford Museum, and he's going to tell you about what we have as we walk underneath our feet here in Clay County.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you. I've spoken to crowds as few as 2, so I should be applauding you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So I've been an archaeologist for the past 38 years. I spent the bulk of my career at the University of Iowa Office of the State Archaeologist. So I have a long tenure of archaeology in Iowa. I'm not a native Iowan. I grew up in northern Minnesota, but I've been here 38 years, so I'm an Iowan. Okay? I'm not leaving. So this is our topic for today, and I'll try and give you a good, what we call a cultural history of Clay County. So what is archaeology? Okay, it's the study of human cultures, humans past. Anthropology, that's what my degrees are in. It's a 4-field study, so there's physical anthropology, which studies the physical person, the skeleton, the musculature, all those types of things. There's cultural anthropology, which studies our religious systems, our political systems, our social systems, our family systems, and those are mostly with living populations. There's linguistics, which is the study of language, and it's actually pivotal in one of the late prehistoric societies here in connecting them with their historic ancestors, and I'll talk about that when we get there. And then there's archaeologists, and if you happen to catch the article in the newspaper, thank you very much for that article, it is true, I am a glorified garbage person, okay? I dig up other people's trash, okay? I don't have a whip, I don't wear a sidearm, I do have a felt fedora, okay? But basically we're interested in material culture to try and help us understand past societies that are no longer here, okay? History is the written record, prehistory is before the written record, and as far as Iowa goes, that dividing line is 1673. When 2 guys named Marquette and Joliet paddled out of the Wisconsin River into the Mississippi, and for the next 150 miles there was Iowa to their right-hand side. And they did contact many people in Iowa, so that's the beginning of history in Iowa, is 1673. So the vast majority of time here in Iowa is prehistory. This is basically how we do archaeology, some of the tools that we use. One of the running jokes is if you're out on a project and you don't find any artifacts, you can always talk about the dirt, okay? And we do, okay? Probably more than you would like to talk about. Stone tools, arrowheads, scrapers, that kind of thing, that's one of my specialties. Rock lasts longer than any other artifact class. And so when I was in college, I thought, oh, that'll always keep me busy because there'll always be rocks to look at. But it's a primary area of study. Humans have been making stone tools for 3 million years. Don't worry about deep time. I have problems with it myself, okay? A long time, let's just put it that way. Ceramic analysis, pottery. People have been making pottery in Iowa for at least 2,800, almost 3,000 years. Tells us all kinds of things, and we'll talk about that too. Radiocarbon dating, using organic material, usually burned, that has carbon in it to get dates. And radiocarbon dating goes back 50,000 years, and it's getting accurate to giving you a date plus or minus 5 or 10 years. So we can really target dates pretty well now. Of course, we use history. When Marquette and Joliet came down the river and they recorded the peoples that they met, they're recording prehistoric peoples. So we can use histories to reach back into time. Statistics, I always get someone to help me with statistics. I am no math whiz, okay? Animal remains, plant remains, those are some of the things that we use in archaeology, and that's a good picture of me that actually wasn't me. Lot of reading. So, this is a little map of Clay County, and the dots all represent the 82 archaeological sites we know of in the county. Okay, there are 76 single component sites and 6 multi-component sites. What that means is 76 of these dots have just one time period or one culture recognized, and 6 of them have at least 2. Okay, so we're all familiar with the world's oldest professions. Okay, always left out are realtors. Okay, because location goes way back in time. If you saw a nice place to build a house, somebody else did before you. Okay, so we often see site above site because they are good places to live. Breaking this down, we have 37 prehistoric period sites, so that's before 1673. 39 historic period sites. In Cherokee County, we don't have anything that's earlier than about 1870, 1860. There's a couple sites, the Kirchner Log House north of Peterson. There's a couple that date into the 1860s, but most of them are post-Civil War. We don't have any Paleo-Indian period sites, no Archaic sites yet. We'll talk about all of these. 4 Woodland period sites. The Woodland is divided into 3 periods, early, middle, late. So for Western science and for Western civilization, 3 is a really important number. Of course, the Trinity, 3 lights on a stoplight, 3 arguments, you win, that kind of thing, okay? So Western science divides things in 3s. And then 8 late prehistoric period sites, and those are sites that date from about 1,000 years ago to the present. Earliest known artifact in Clay County is 13,500 years old. It's a projectile point or a spear tip called a Clovis point. I'll show you a picture shortly. Every county in Iowa has had Clovis points found in them. And as far as Iowa goes, that's the earliest recognized human occupation. But as far as the North American continent goes, we're confident that people were here at least 25,000 years ago. And modern humans, which we all are, spread across the globe about 70,000 years ago. There's no reason why we won't get to earlier dates. We just have to go find them, okay? And when I go through this, you'll figure out why we don't find stuff, okay? Iowa has examples of incredible artifacts from all over the continent. Copper, obsidian, shark's teeth, ocean shells, minerals, all kinds of things, trade, interactions, movement of peoples. North America is every bit as dynamic as any place else on the globe. People are people. We all do the same things, same reasons. So here's the 3, okay? So all that 13,000 years is broken down into Paleo-Indian, Archaic, and Woodland periods. And then the Archaic and the Woodland are broken down into early, middle, late. The Paleo-Indian is so far back and so thinly spread across the landscape, we haven't found a lot of it yet, okay? I know out of those 37 prehistoric sites, at least a couple are Paleo-Indian sites. But unless I find an artifact, which we consider a diagnostic artifact, I'm not going to know what the chips of rock that were left from making tools or the fire-cracked rock from a hearth. I don't know who left them. So this is the basic breakdown, and then when we get to the late prehistoric in Clay County, there are 3 specific cultures which I'll talk about. They're really fascinating. All right, so Paleo-Indians, these are the earliest peoples we know of. Archaeologists refer to these as projectile points. The bow and arrow didn't come into Iowa until about 2,000 years ago. So for that 14,000 years, the first 12, there was no bow and arrow. So basically, there were large projectile points that were attached to 6-foot shafts that were thrown with a spear thrower or an atlatl. You heard of an atlatl? Aztecs used them. Scared the heck out of the Spanish because it would go right through their chainmail. Yeah, really, really fascinating weapons. This was a time when there was still active ice sheets in Iowa, when there was megafauna, mammoths, woolly rhinos, camels, horses, giant beavers, all kinds of large animals we'll never see. But there were people living in Iowa at the time, and although the last ice advance, which we live on, called the Des Moines Lobe, moved into Iowa about 15,000 years ago, it didn't get to Des Moines until about 13,500 years ago. So there were already people here. And that ice sheet moved fast enough, people living here would have been able to see it move seasonally. So they lived in a place where we'll never know, we'll never see. We either have to recreate it in our imaginations or hope Hollywood can do it right, okay? They were probably small, very mobile groups. There are few known sites in northwest Iowa, but there are a few. None of them have been excavated, okay? They all made these large, what we call leaf-shaped points. They all have some specific characteristics. The bases are ground dull, so they could be hafted without damage. Most of these started their lives out as knives. Most projectile points started their lives as knives, okay? And then they reduced to dart points, and then you get true arrowheads, you'll see later. Huge difference. But these folks hunted a broad range of things, from the large megafauna all the way down to birds and fish. Clovicites, anyone want to dare guess what the most common animal bone in Clovis assemblages 13,000 years ago? It's not mammoth.
Mastodon.
Muskrat's a good guess, not mastodon, none of the big animals.
Beaver, maybe?
Beaver's a good one, fish is a good one. Turtles. Turtles are the most common, and if you've ever had snapping turtle, it's pretty tasty. But it's not very impressive to be the mighty turtle hunters. Okay? So anthropologists kind of do that stuff back in the day, you know, pre-World War II. There was a lot of boasting and statements that weren't really supported by data. So we move out of the Paleo-Indian into the Archaic period. Again, we don't have any archaic sites identified in Clay County yet. Okay? They were hunting an extinct form of bison, which you see right there. Half again as big as bison today. Big animals. And if you think of a longhorn, that was the span of their horns. A formidable animal, but when you can take them down, it's a lot of food. 9,000 to 2,800 years ago, small groups still, and by that I mean maybe 30, 40, maybe 60. You know, Paleo-Indian maybe 20, 30. Still a mobile way of life. They would travel seasonally to harvest various resources. Spear points are getting a little bit smaller, and they absolutely, in terms of using projectiles, were definitely using an atlatl. Spear throwers date back at least 25,000 years, so there's no reason why people who came into North America didn't have atlatls, okay? We just haven't found the archaeological remains of them yet. That's because they're all made out of bone, wood, or antler, and that decays real fast, okay? And when you're in a place like Iowa, the soils are fairly acidic, so unless the bone, wood, or antler is burnt, it just doesn't last. And when it gets pulled into the plow zone, it decays really fast. Lots of hide processing. About 8,000 years and groundstone tools start to be made. And that's what's known as the Neolithic or the New Stone Age. And that's really, really fascinating because it happens the same time all across the globe. And no archaeologist I've ever heard or anthropologist has a reason why. You know, there wasn't connection between people in Britain and people in Iowa, but they started making groundstone tools the same time. So it must be something about the way we think or what the conditions were in our external world that brought on a new way of managing resources. but it's just very interesting. Thank goodness we have lots of questions to work on. Okay, so I'm going to borrow the Cherokee sewer site from your neighboring county. This was discovered in the early 70s when they were constructing the sewage treatment plant in Cherokee. And it was buried quite deep, and you can see that's probably one reason why we don't find archaic sites. It appears as though they were in river valleys and such that they got buried. I've worked on projects in my 38 years where we hand dig down 9 to 12 feet. That's about as far as we can go without mechanical help. So most of the projects that we work on don't go deeper than that. But when they do, you get backhoes. The Cherokee sewer site was a bison kill site. There are 3 different components between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago. They showed some difference in seasons. One of the horizons must have been in the spring because there's a lot of young bison that were taken. And so archaeological sites can tell us a lot about environmental conditions. And we're taking the big bones and excavating the hearth features. We're also taking soil samples and washing them to see what kind of seeds, what kind of pollen, what kind of insects we're finding. So we look from macroscopic to tiny microscopic stuff to try and learn as much as we can. This site was really interesting because it produced Iowa's oldest known musical instrument. This is actually what it looks like. It's about this long. It's the upper arm bone of a swan, the humerus. And by the placement of the 2 holes, there's a 3rd and a 4th hole there. Recreation and musicians tell us straight away, oh, well, that was a pentatonic scale. It's exactly a musical scale we'd recognize. So these folks had music, entertainment, stories. I mean, no different than us. So after this long period of the Archaic, where there's really dynamic technological change, and one thing I'll say right now before we go into the Woodland, unless there was environmental changes that came rapidly, unless somehow you ticked off your neighbors, or there was an influx of new peoples, people weren't struggling. They weren't living hand to mouth. They had good food to eat. They had stable living conditions. They had clans, which were huge extended families. Okay? So just like us, unless something typically outside acts upon us, we do pretty good. And that's the same for Native Americans. So really dispense with the idea that they were hanging on to the edge of survival. No, they weren't. That's why we see long periods of projectile points that are made the same. Sometimes a couple thousand years, the style of a point doesn't change. And that all suggests that it worked. So they were doing well. Another idea to take too is that, not in a political sense, but humans are a conservative species. We don't change things just for the sake of change. And if you're thinking about a hunting weapon that worked last week, you probably don't want to change it because it might mean it doesn't work next week. So to change the form of a tool could be a big risk in changing its effectiveness. And we all might or might not be superstitious, or, knock on wood when you want to make sure something doesn't happen. That's referred to sort of as sympathetic magic. We all do that whether we know it or not because we don't want to jinx things. And it's same for people all over the globe, and it's certainly same for people through time. So some of these things that have gotten into our understandings of prehistory have to be rubbed out because they're just not true. Okay? The Woodland is fascinating. We see more technological change and more societal change. Pottery starts to be made in the Middle Woodland. And we see precursors of it earlier than 2,800 years ago. But it's actually really clear to see, if we take archaeology going towards the American Southwest and Mexico, absolutely clearly see pottery technology coming out of Mexico. In Iowa, we have really crappy clay. So you have to add something to it to get it to hold together. And so that was part of the technological innovations that they had to pick up and understand as pottery became a daily tool. So pottery, more people living in more sedentary places. So they would live longer in one place. They're already practicing horticulture, which means they're collecting wild seeds from crops and other foods they harvested the year before. They'll broadcast them in the environments the next spring where there's fresh silt on floodplains or what have you, and then keep their fingers crossed till the fall and come back and see what they can harvest. So they were already doing that by the time the woodland starts. They have gardens of little barley, goosefoot, marsh elder, sunflowers, squash, all kinds of plants. And one of them I don't have on, yeah, I have marsh elder on here. I think it's marsh elder. It was actually domesticated to the point that after woodland people stopped using it as a foodstuff, it got very scarce on the landscape because domesticated crops have a really hard time of propagating themselves on their own. And so we still have marsh elder because there was enough wild stock to mix back in with the domestic. So we have it. Okay, but they were also using wild plums, wild onion. There's a whole variety of other foodstuffs, and the medicinal plants are just amazing. In this part of the state, in Clay County, we're on the Des Moines Lobe, but the Northwest Iowa Plain isn't far off, and the Luss Hills aren't far away. So they've got a really dynamic environmental zone where they can access all kinds of foodstuffs and all kinds of medicinal plants. They start building burial mounds in the woodland period. And they also see the introduction of the bow and arrow. And these are actual arrow points, not much bigger than an inch in size. And you see a really rapid reduction from the archaic points that are a good 4 inches down to a point that's only 1 inch. So it's really interesting. And again, archaeologically, you can see the bow and arrow come down the Canadian plains from Alaska. So the Eskimos and Inuits who migrated into North America, they're the ones who sent that technology down to everybody else. This vessel is really interesting. It's a middle woodland vessel that's roughly 2,000 years old. And you can see the little bumps on here. I have to get one of these and show people how it's done or get a picture of it. So we call those punctates. Every discipline has jargon, okay? I could give you a whole talk using jargon. You'd never know what I was talking about. So these are punched from the inside. So there's a little indentation all around that. So if you take small sticks and you put them in between each of those holes, you get a little surface, a little layer. You make yourself a nice little woven cap for the top of the bowl, put water in it, put your vegetables and meat on the top of all the skewers, you have a steamer. And so University of Kansas has worked with ceramics in taking burned food residue, and I don't know if they did, but somebody produced a little cookbook, because one of the recipes they were able to tease out by looking at carbohydrates, fats, and proteins and figuring out what they belonged to was a venison stew that had wild mint and wild onions and I forget what else in it. You know, that's a stew I'd eat. Yeah, these people ate well. How many times you go off to work or wherever you're going in the morning and you're thinking, what shall I have for dinner? You know, pretty much. Some things don't change. We do have a number of burial mounds in Iowa, and particularly in Clay County. And here's a set at Kindlespire Park. So I've been working at Kindlespire Park recently, and this is LiDAR, it's light amplified radar. It's flown from aircraft at about 20,000 feet above the ground surface, and its mechanism can go right through vegetation. So it can go right through tree cover, shrubs, all of that. And so that's a picture of the Little Sioux River Valley at Kindlespire Park. And all of these other little wiggly things are previous channels of the river. So LiDAR is mapping the ground surface in about 3-inch contours. Your basic map that you might look at, 10-foot contours. Maybe 5 feet if it's, accurate in certain parts. So this has been fantastic. And in Kindlespire Park, I'll switch to this side. This is the road that comes down in, and the boat ramps right off of here. So on this terrace is where I've been working for the last year. We found a middle woodland site that's about 1,800 years old. It's buried about 2.5 feet below the surface. But above on the ridge, I don't know if you can see these little bumps. Those are conical burial mounds, anywhere from 1,200 to 2,000 years old. The site was first recorded in 1974. We didn't have any GPS. No archaeologist has really been back since, so it'll be my job one day this spring to go out with a GPS unit and record how many mounds, where are they exactly, and get a new map drawn. But there are a number of prehistoric sites in that 37 that are mound, at least 6 that are mounds. And I'm actually working now in northwest Iowa, north and west of the Little Sioux River Valley to find more, because we've suddenly realized there's a whole lot more in a place we didn't expect to look for them. So Kindle Spire has been really interesting, and I'm looking forward to continue to work there. The site number is 13CY83, and I should say right away that's the Smithsonian trinomial system. So almost every state in the Union identifies their archaeological sites by 13, that's Iowa alphabetically listed. CY is Clay County. And the Kindle Spire site is the 83rd recorded in the state. Okay? And I know I said there are 82 sites. Well, one of the 83 is a paleontological site, so it doesn't count for archaeology. 40 years ago, they gave those a site number and then suddenly realized, 20 years ago, we shouldn't do that. Okay? So even though it's number 83, there's only 82 in the county. Anyway. So this is 13CY4. So this was the 4th site recorded in Clay County, and that was 1974. So I think Johnson County, where Iowa City is, because there's been so much municipal development. I mean, there's a couple of interstates. There's obviously Iowa City Coralville. There's all of that urban development. They have like 1,800 sites. Okay? And a site can be anything from one arrowhead found to one piece of historic stoneware found. Sites aren't necessarily big. We find an archaeological site every 2 acres on average. Okay? So the 82 that are represented in Clay County are just simply because we have no 4-lane highways. We don't have a huge metro. We don't have those types of things that would mean federal land or money or state land or money kicks in environmental impact rules. So my 32 years at the University of Iowa was mainly doing environmental impact archaeology. So I surveyed from Moreland outside of Fort Dodge all the way to Early for Highway 20. That was one project that I did. 50 miles, 2,000 some acres, 1,200 bucket augers, which are subsurface tests. Crew of 10. It was a blast. Okay? So that's sort of our situation here. We just don't have the things that would cause us to do archaeology in a mandatory way. So one of the things I want to do working at the Sanford is motivate people like you to help people like me figure out who has collections, what people, farmers, landowners know of where someone found artifacts. The artifacts are wonderful. We don't want them. But we want to help you understand what they are, and we'd really like you to tell us where you found them and what you found them with. That's the information exchange I'd really like to have. So if this project can be a motivator for that, we got a web page, I got an email, okay? So after the Woodland, we move into late prehistoric, and that's like 1,200 years ago to about 350 years ago, Marquette and Joliet. They're full-fledged sedentary farmers. They're living in villages, some of them quite big. They're growing corn. Corn comes into Iowa about 800 years ago as a crop. And it clearly, again, comes up from the south-southwest. They're also growing sunflower, pigweed, lamb's quarter, squash, beans, tobacco, and more. If any of you guys are farmers or not, I'm guessing you probably hate pigweed and lamb's quarter, okay? But they're both very nutritious plants, okay? You can eat the leaves early in the spring, lamb's quarter particularly in a salad. It's very nice. They have a very oily seed head that's edible, but it also gives you vegetable oil to cook with. They're hunting bison, but they're also hunting everything else that moves, basically, okay? And as I said, they live in, I call semi-permanent villages, but they're pretty permanent for the most part. So the first culture we see in Clay County is called the Great Oasis culture. If you think of your spaghetti noodle pot, you're boiling in water, it's just getting started, and you get that first bubble, and another bubble, and another bubble, the convection cells. Great Oasis would be one of those cultural convection cells of sedentary farmers. Okay? The pre-Iroquois in New York State, they're a convection cell. There's a culture in northern Georgia called the Woodstock culture. They're doing the same things with corn agriculture and sedentary villages. So about 1,200 years ago, about 800 AD, you see small cultural centers of sedentary farmers sprouting up all over the eastern half of the country. Okay, there are some bigger centers already, but now you're seeing broad spread sedentary culture everywhere. They're a mix of agriculture and hunting and fishing. They're the earliest corn farmers in Iowa. They have two pottery types, a high rim, and I didn't get a picture of a wedge lip, but that makes them very distinctive. We can always tell this is Great Oasis because nobody else makes pot rims with that design. If you're familiar with Highway 75 going north out of Sioux City, and you cross the Floyd River, the little town of Leeds is on the west. Well, if you're going north, the off-ramp to the east that goes to Leeds, there's a Great Oasis site buried in the middle of that. Okay? Yeah. And there were 3 house structures found when we did a full-scale excavation. Women made the pottery. This triangular-shaped parallel line motif is standard on their pots. And then because women made the pottery, they'd want to decorate them distinctly to their matrilineal descent line. So they would often put turkey tracks on them or a little deer out, a stick figure, and I forget what the other one was, but each of the 3 houses at this site in Sioux City had a different decorative motif. So there were 3 different matrilineal women's families in each of those houses. And in Native American tradition, women were the farmers. Okay? The earth was female, no man could farm it, that's just wrong, okay? And so it was hard then for the US government to get Native American men to become farmers because they just didn't, it's not what they did. But I thought that was really interesting with Great Oasis. So we not only know a lot about them in general, we actually know about specific things in terms of how descent went. And the women in these houses, they owned the houses, they owned all the stuff, okay? So you got to pitch sexual divisions that we hold right out the window because they don't work, okay? So they were really interesting peoples, but kind of short-lived, about 200, 250 years. And they lived in southwest Minnesota, northwest Iowa, southeast South Dakota, and actually over and down into the Des Moines River Valley. So they're an interesting culture spread all out, and you can see little tiny arrowheads. Great Oasis probably became the Mill Creek culture, and they're really well known in northwest Iowa. They were around for a slightly shorter period of time. Again, permanent villages, farming. Oftentimes their villages were slightly elevated, and that was probably from building upon 100 years worth of Great Oasis villages. They lived in earth lodges. An earth lodge has to be rebuilt about every 15 years because it gets full of bugs and rots. So you got to kind of push it in, burn it, and then you level it out and build on top. So they get built on elevated platform-like villages. Oddly enough, Mill Creek villages are fortified. We don't know why exactly. Okay, so they have a ditch, and all the dirt from the ditch is thrown up on a ridge around the village. I have a picture of one. And then they put a palisade wall on top. And their villages typically were about the size of, if you think of Spencer's football field, and you take the first wall around the field and make that your palisade wall, that's how big their villages were. We're not quite sure why they fortified. We have some guesses. Agriculture, hunting, fishing, gathering. They had cultural contacts across the continent. They disappeared kind of suddenly. We kind of don't know why. This is an example from the Whit Rock site. It's a fortified Mill Creek village over on Mill Creek, and I can't remember where the county line is. I think it falls in, yeah, I think it falls in O'Brien County. Anyways, this is what it looks like. And if you can see this line, that's the ditch and the ridge inside, and there'd be a palisade wall. And each of these little depressions, that would be an earth lodge. Earth lodges were 10 by 14, maybe 12 by 16 feet. 8 to 12 people lived in one. So at Whit Rock, there are 20 lodges inside there. If you got 10 people in every lodge, that's 200 people. 200 people. When early historic contact came down rivers and all, they knew they were getting to a village because they would see crops oftentimes miles ahead of the village. If you're growing enough crops to feed 200 people, you're going to have probably several hundred acres of crops in production. So a mile downstream from Whit Rock in an expanding fish and wildlife preserve, if you've ever been east of Sutherland, a mile away while we were testing for the addition of new land to this preserve, 2 feet below the ground surface, we started pulling up Mill Creek pottery. And it was from a farming station out in the middle of their fields, where the moms and kids would go during the day. The kids would take their small bows and arrows and other things and take care of the vermin eating the crops. And the women would be making pottery and doing other stuff. And that's a mile away from the Whit Rock site. So this is sort of what one of their houses look like. And as I said, they're 10 by 14 feet, kind of. And they may just simply have hickory or other bark siding, but most of the time they'd have what's called wattle and daub. So you'd get small saplings and put them in vertically and then weave smaller saplings in, much like you'd make a braided rag rug. And it would be tight enough then you would either get mud and plaster it, or you would actually cut sod blocks and it would literally be a sod house. Now, the cool thing about Mill Creek peoples is at the time, there's a big city in East St. Louis, a place called Cahokia. Has anybody ever been there? Yeah, all right, good. Yeah. It was the largest urban center in the U.S. or Canada. Okay, from 800 to 1350, it was, and I mean it's a metropolitan area. At its height, around 1,000 to 1150, there were between 20 and 40,000 people who lived there. And you would far rather live there than Berlin or London or Paris because Cahokia had sewage systems. They had rainwater runoff channels where they borrowed earth to build their mounds and such. They would treat them particularly so the water that filled them up would remain clean for drinking. I mean, a really high level of culture. And the largest mound, the largest earthen structure north of the Valley of Mexico is at Cahokia. It's called Monk's Mound. The base takes up about the size of 4 or 5 football fields. It's 120 feet high. I should have put a picture in. Up on the highest level, where only political and religious elites could be, there's a couple of trash pits full of Mill Creek material. So for some reason, the Mill Creek people who lived exclusively in northwest Iowa had a high status position in the largest metropolitan area in the US or Canada. And again, we don't know why. We don't know what they brought, what they offered the Cahokians, but it's really interesting and it's always on the mind of archaeologists who work in the late prehistoric to try and figure out, well, why is that? You know? Why did they fortify their villages? I mean, if you're agriculturalists and you're producing a surplus, well, that's easy pickings for someone who's not. So that could be the reason. But we really don't know. I can't think of a Mill Creek village site that has shown evidence of some kind of conflict. So until we find one or someone has a better idea, I don't know. So after the Onota, or after the Mill Creek, the Onota move in. The Onota are a culture that develops as Cahokia is collapsing. So these are people who are leaving the urban center because we got to get out of Dodge. okay? And so they develop in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin, but then they expand to the west and north. You can find Onota villages all the way from Illinois, Wisconsin to as far west almost as Lincoln. You can find them as far south as St. Louis, and they go as far north as Winnipeg. These are late prehistoric peoples. They're the ancestors of the Iowa, the Oto, the Ponca, the Ho-Chunk, and some of the eastern Dakota peoples. And a woman named Mildred Mott Wadle in the 1930s, she's recognized as the mother of Iowa archaeology. First anthropology PhD from the University of Chicago. And she studied linguistics, and she was able to match Siouan speakers, Dakota peoples and others, their pottery decorations with Onota pottery decorations. And then recognized there were other artifacts that were very similar. And so she worked out the idea that these were Siouan speakers, and they're associated with the Onota. So historic Iowas recognize the Onota as their ancestors. They were the first pipestone artists, the Iowa. They probably were the first to go to the pipestone quarries and actually get the raw material that is pink and soft and easily carved. You can't see it here, but there's a water monster motif on this. It's a tablet about this big. We have it at the Sanford Museum, and 12 or 14 years ago, it spent 3 years at the Louvre in Paris because they had a big display on late Native Americans in North America from, I forget, something like 1400 to 1800. So Sanford Museum had an artifact on display in France. Pretty cool. Large permanent villages, they're not fortified, not at all. So what changed? We don't know. There doesn't seem to be any conflict between the peoples who would have lived here when the Onota moved in. We don't know. Large scale agriculture. Corn, squash, and beans were the three main crops you think of as the Three Sisters crops. Big bison hunts heading out west. But there are also bison local here still. But we do find Iowa artifacts in sites in Kansas and Nebraska. So they were probably heading out to other Onota relatives in those areas. There's a lot of sites along the Little Sioux in Clay County, at least 5 Onota sites. Gillette Grove is a really prominent one. The University of Iowa Office of the State Archaeologist about 15 years ago spent, I think, 6 seasons excavating at Gillette Grove. It's a large village site, something like 20 to 30 acres, probably 400 to 600 people. Yeah, very big. I excavated at a site called Dixon, which is 2 miles south of Anthon, which is about 10 miles south of Correctionville. Materials from across the continent. Some of their stone tools were being made from rock as far as western South Dakota and eastern Wyoming. They clearly had connections to Wisconsin because we found raw materials from there. They were making all kinds of pipestone artifacts. Storage pits. So you dig down into the ground. Once you get a foot below, the ground is always about 55 degrees. So you can store vegetable material in those kinds of refrigerated conditions for 3 to 4 years. You know, you get rot creeps in, but basically 4 years later you can still eat the corn and beans in it. You can store meat up to a year or so. And then when they're done and they've emptied the storage pit, well, it becomes a trash pit because you got to throw your junk somewhere. And these pits I can stand in, they're about this deep and they're about this big around. Big storage pits, lots of people, lots of food, lots of garbage. So it's a really interesting time. And like I say, 5 or 6 sites along the Little Sioux in Clay County. I think so far Gillette Grove is the only one that's been archaeologically excavated. The rest are all either in cultivated fields or in some circumstance where they were eroded, artifacts were found, sites were recorded, but no excavations were done. Okay? There just aren't enough of us. Okay? So that brings us up to 1673, early beginnings of Iowa. The fur trade, people were here before 1832 when you were allowed to come into Iowa. This happens to be the Kirchner log house just north of Peterson, 1867. one of the very earliest settlement structures left in Clay County. That's a kind of classic picture depicting wagon trains arriving in Clay County. That's an early settler in the Spencer vicinity. And that's another picture of someone just across the bridge along the Little Sioux in Spencer. We opened for settlement in 1832. Pioneers began to arrive here in the 1850s. The Homestead Act in 1862 provided federal government assistance to expand into the West. So if you want to think about it, from 1850 to 1875, Clay County was the western frontier. It seriously was. So was Sac County and Cherokee County. We were the Wild West. Didn't last as long, so we didn't get the notoriety that they did further west, but everything that went on there for 25 or 30 years went on here for 12, okay? Saloons, boarding houses, gunfights, all of it. And then, of course, we get into the historic period. And again, these are all elements of Spencer, your library. That's not where the newspaper still is, but anyway. Your courthouse, fire department. And all of these things boon transportation, agriculture, education, technology, recreation. And that pretty much brings us up to modern Spencer. So in 45 minutes, that was 13,000 years of Clay County. Okay? I'm happy to entertain questions or engage in conversation, yeah.
Do you ever go down to Western Woods and see the Indian mountains down there?
I've been there once, and it's been a while, yes. Those are very well preserved, yeah. And that's very nice when you get mounds in any kind of county, state, or federal preserve or park.
Yeah, that's what Meadows Camp there.
Oh, that's right, it is, isn't it? Well, good for them. Oak Hill Cemetery in Cherokee on the west side has mounds in it that are kind of preserved between grave sites. And that actually happened a lot in Iowa. The churches recognize burial mounds as sacred spaces and would incorporate them into their cemeteries. So, I'm glad to know that. I'll have to go back now. I thought it was a county park.
On my farm, I got a couple of big burial mounds. They're 50 feet long, maybe 30 feet wide, a couple feet high.
Okay.
So one assumes those are burial mounds.
Yes.
Okay. Then a couple miles south of me, I was looking on a map, and I found 13 burial mounds out there, the biggest little ones. Would that be just like one person? Or
It could be. The larger mounds typically were used longer. The mounds that were used longer were typically a bit earlier. They're real common in the middle woodland period. There were more people on the landscape in the middle woodland, okay? And so I sort of suspect yours sound like they might be middle woodland in age, 400 BC to 400 AD.
Okay. And then the lower mounds?
Later in time. And they probably have fewer people in them, yes. And there weren't as many people in a group, and so they wouldn't build quite as big, okay? But it's also a matter of how you build them. And the whole point of Native American internment is to see those people back to the soil, back to dust. We say that too, ashes to ashes, okay? And so that's what they intend. So as they degrade and get smaller, they're fine with it. We don't excavate burial mounds. We haven't for, wow, 45, 50 years. This is great. Thank you for bringing that up. Iowa has the oldest burial protection laws of any state in the Union. 1976, a woman named Maria Pearson. She was a Yankton Sioux. Her name was Running Moccasins. Her husband was a DOT engineer. They were building Highway 80. They got to the Council Bluffs vicinity and encountered a cemetery. They excavated all the historical burials and brought them to another cemetery to be reburied. And the 2 or 3 Native American burials they found, they put in cardboard boxes and brought them to the University of Iowa. Maria didn't like that. So she went into Governor Ray's office and waited an afternoon knowing he was in his office, even though the secretary said, no, you can't see him, you don't have an appointment. So she waited for him, and finally when she got in, she said, hey, you know, and she used to call him, apparently, her great white father. I knew Maria. Terribly funny. She did it on purpose. But he said, yeah, that's wrong. And so between the two of them and the state archaeologist, who I believe was Dwayne Anderson at the time, who, before he became the state archaeologist at the University of Iowa, was the archaeologist at the Sanford. So between the three of them, they crafted Iowa's burials protection laws. States like Arizona followed suit very fast, and you would think they would have had them. Arizona's got lots more flashy archaeology than we do, but they crafted their burial protection laws after us. So that's a really good thing. Burials are protected by law. If you don't know they're there and you accidentally run into them, there's a series of things you're supposed to do. Not a problem. I think everybody, when they run into human bones, kind of reaches out to law enforcement anyway. But as an aside, since you know you have them, Iowa also has, as of 2007-ish, tax incentives. If you have burials, if you have archaeological sites, and you're actively conserving them and trying to preserve them, there are tax breaks available.
Oh.
Yeah, just contact the Iowa Heritage Foundation.
So how would you, if you have a burial site of that size, there would probably lilies there somewhere.
Oftentimes, yes.
How, I've never seen any land formations or anything that looks like there'd ever be a village.
You wouldn't. You probably wouldn't. They're village sites, unless they were Mill Creek, they're not distinctive enough. They're not bounded by a tight space and therefore had a unique physical characteristic. So you'd either have to see the artifacts in an adjacent cultivated field, or you'd have to get an archaeologist out to start digging holes. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Any questions?
How can we volunteer to help some of these sites as volunteers?
Oh, well, you can join the Iowa Archaeological Society, and then you can join the Northwest chapter, and we meet monthly at the Sanford and Cherokee, and I think it'll set you back like 25 bucks. Okay, but you'll get newsletters, you'll get online information. I try and have February, March, April, I try and have weekend activities at the museum. We'll have one this Saturday, sifting dirt. It's not flashy, but it's necessary, okay? And I will have a 2-week field school at the Kirchner Log House site this summer. They're going to be replacing some rotted lower timbers, and so we need to excavate those areas before they're impacted from the restoration work. I'm also trying to line up some other weekend excavations where we can go look for sites and try and find sites that have been previously put on the records. So that's the best way to get involved. I've been there a year and a half. I'm trying to get a program going where I have regular events for people to participate in. Okay, but if you know of sites, if you've got them on your property, you know people who collect, if they're willing to share that information, that's another really good way you can get involved. And like I say, you go to the Sanford Museum website, and my email address and all is in the upper right-hand corner drop-down menu. Okay? And I do answer emails. Yeah.
Have you been to the big in South Dakota?
I have not, but I did my field school in Mitchell, so I know what it is. Yeah. Yeah, I just have not got there.
I'm going to move on that a little bit. That's pretty interesting.
Oh, good, good. Most archaeological sites will take volunteers. You know, I always love screaming at my crews, more dirt faster. You know? So extra hands make lighter work. So it's not often that we have excavations that need all hands, but it does happen. So the Iowa Archaeological Society has a certification program. If you're really into archaeology, I've got 2 people working on their certifications now. So there's a bunch of ways you can get involved in archaeology. Yeah. So I noticed you've got an artifact. Can I look at it? Yep, that is a maul or a sledgehammer. Okay, it's what we call fully grooved, and the surface here is pitted to a different texture than the rest of it. This is a tool that is about 1,000 years old. Okay, and these would have been used for pounding stakes in the ground, especially the posts for their earth lodges. posts around their hearths for drying racks and other structures. It would have had a lot of uses. Smashing up other rocks, breaking holes in the ice in the winter so they can fish. There's all kinds of uses for these. Yeah, thanks for
I
bringing
did
it
not
in.
find it. Someone else found it. I found it. In a form of drilling site.
Okay.
So someone else found it and they
Right.
picked it up and left it for me.
Oh, that's excellent. Good for them. And see, I said, location, location, location. Yeah, that's the deal. This is actually interesting again because there's a pit on the surface right here, and there's a damaged spot right here. So when this wasn't being used for a sledgehammer, it was used as an anvil. And that's not surprising. How many things can we use a screwdriver for besides driving screws, With points and plugs, it was said, at least by my brother, the mechanic, that you could tune a car with a hammer. Okay? Not sure that was true. But tools for everybody are multi-purpose. And so oftentimes with these types of tools, we will see other areas where a different use was applied. So to me, stone tools are endlessly fascinating. I also make them and use them.
So what kind, like, what is that rock?
This is granite.
Granite?
Yeah, it needs to be something really hard like granite or a metamorphic rock. Yeah. And to make one of these, to get the groove in it and the overall shape, it takes about 40 hours. So about 8-hour days of work to make these.
What did they make the groove with?
It's a method called pecking and grinding. So you would have a more narrow piece of rock and you would just go whack, 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 tick, 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 tick. And I always figured you'd send the kids away to do the rough out because it would be maddening otherwise. When I made these, and I've made them a bunch of times, that kind of whack, 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 it's just like you put earphones on because, yeah. So then what you do is you take water and sand and you get a different type of rock that's the right width and you grind it and grind it and grind it. And then if you want a nice polish, you'll take a piece of leather, wet, water, sand, and you use that just like you go through grades of sandpaper. Yeah. And then this doesn't have a tapered bit for an axe, but formed the same way. And of course, we always want to have the least amount of work involved. So you pick a rock that's closest to the shape you want, then you just have less work to do. Yeah. But that's generally how they're made.
Would it be the men that made the tools then?
Probably, for the most part, but that's a really good question. So everyone had to know how to chip rock or make chip stone tools. Because you always have to repair yourself. If you're out on your own collecting resources, better fix your broken tool because you can't call someone else, okay? But I love this example, the Pawnee. Agriculturalists, out in the farm fields of the Pawnee, there are napping stations. The only people who can be there napping are women because men can't be out there. That's not what they do. So again, we have to pitch gender roles of who did what where. And realized that there were women nappers that were every bit as good as any male napper. So nappers, there's probably about 6,000 of us in the United States and Canada. I know several who are women. Angela Parker lives in Pella. She's fantastic. So 6,000 nappers in the US and Canada are cranking out about 1 million projectile points a year. So as a hobbyist, we're making a lot of stuff. And we're all very, very, very careful to not let it get mixed up with what might be ancient.
I had a skinning knife or scraper knife or something like that.
Okay.
And the napping on them was just so soft.
It's made with a pressure flaker. Instead of striking the flakes off, you use the pointed end of a tine. This is great. We're all old enough to know what a Cherokee is. Yep. Okay? Yeah. So it's
Kids don't, though.
no, I know they don't. So it's the same idea. You get the pointed end of the tine on, and you build up pressure, and then you just turn your hand just enough to pop the flake off. And that's called pressure flaking. Most of the small arrow points are made strictly from pressure flaking. Okay? And if I want to make a bigger projectile to be used as a knife, it takes me about an hour. It's not the toughest part. Getting the handles, getting the shafts, preparing the glue, getting the sinew, finding the feathers, or killing the bird that has the feathers, all take way more time than chipping stone tools. Yeah. So.
So you talked about the gender reversals. Weren't most of the women hunters and gatherers?
Yeah, so if we look at, I don't even know what the word is anymore because political correctness has gone everywhere. So if you just call, the last term in my anthropology background was simple societies. Okay, so if you look like the Kung Bushmen of South Africa, or if you look at tribal societies in the Amazon, okay, about 60+% of your foodstuffs and such are gathered. So it's the women and kids. 40% is brought in by men. Yes, it's the high volume protein, and along with that, because it's animal, comes a huge amount of raw material for other tools, bone and antler. But yes, the gathering part provides you a lot more food. And when you look at those societies, out of a 7-day week, it really only takes them about 4 days to get all the food they need for the week. So then they kill 3 days making tools and telling stories and visiting and, complaining and, all those kinds of things. Yeah. Yeah.
Might you build the walls for the great bison migration to prevent them from tackling your village?
So when I was in field school in Mitchell, South Dakota, one way we got a break on our cost, well, not when we were in the field school, but several of us came back to donate to the next year. We'd give tours on the weekends, and we'd attend the museum, and one of the fellows there gave just us archaeology students a tour, and he was hilarious because that's what he proposed, was that the ditch and palisade was to prevent the bison from stampeding the village. And I think that might have actually been kind of true. But a lot of these villages are placed where you just really wouldn't have that kind of activity from bison. It's on the edge of a drainage on a cut bank. So it's really not a place where bison are just accidentally gonna stampede, The fortifications probably served a bunch of purposes. One I didn't mention is a very effective fire break, because prairie fires were normal on an annual basis. And Native Americans from about 7,000 years on, it's very clearly seen in the record, helped to advance the prairies to the east because of their use of fire. And they knew very well how to burn certain areas that were no longer productive for the animals that they wanted. So I think fortification is a really good effect to prevent fires. But why just the Mill Creek? How come the Great Oasis didn't and the Onota didn't? That's, one of those things we got to wonder about for a while yet.
Were there more buffalo in that area?
No, a fellow at East Tennessee named Chris Widka helped me on the project I did south of Anthem. And he said there would have been a bison almost up to the historic contact period. There would have been bison in the Little Sioux here. Yeah. Late, up to 1700. Yep, yeah.
I think it's, down there they have, the bison statues where they used to chase them and they off the cliff.
Oh, yeah.
And they do that same here, maybe it's your area they know for.
They would. And there is a site in Cherokee County called the Simonson site, where they did run bison up a draw where they couldn't get up the hill. And I think there's 8 or 9 of them that were killed. And I think there's only about 4 that were butchered.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's unusual.
No. So there are bison jumps in Colorado and Alberta and Saskatchewan and Montana where they're running tens of animals off the edge. The Lindenmeyer bison jump in Colorado has about 34 bison and only about the top 11 are butchered. Okay, so again, don't think of these people. I love the Far Side commercial cartoon where he's holding up the squiggly thing and says, "This is the only thing of the bison we don't use." Okay, not true. Okay, they're just like us. We did the same thing. Africans did the same thing. South Americans did the same thing. We don't intend to kill that many and not be able to use them, but it happens because we want to eat. And so, yeah, you do the best you can. At Lindenmeyer, there's very interesting bison skulls that have painted zigzags on their foreheads and stuff. So there was obviously religious, philosophical, clear associations with hunting and killing and having to recognize that we're sorry we couldn't use them all. But then we have the same things in our background in Europe and other places. So, yeah, just to dispel, I'm glad you brought that up. That happened. It happened here in Iowa. Yeah. Few and far between. We don't know too many. And the Simonson site is buried because the Little Sioux River flooded. And
When did the Iowa Indians get horses?
in the mid 1600s. Yeah. Completely changed their culture. I mean, 180 degrees changed their culture.
Then you can move.
Oh boy, did they move, yeah. And the Iowa, not so much as the Plains people. They really went nomadic. The Lakota and Dakota, or the Sioux, they were largely sedentary until they got the horse. And then they ditched agriculture and headed out after bison, and yeah, completely different life. Yes, yep, yep. And they belonged to the women. TVs did. And all the furnishings belonged to the women. Yeah. And so when you see Hollywood movies, realize you're getting about 5 or so Indians mashed together, okay? Because the war bonnets are for one. You can tell different groups by the way they make their moccasins. So you can't see that in Hollywood movies. But the dress, the beadwork, the decorations, the teepees, you got about 5 different groups all made into a Hollywood Indian, you know. But that's how Hollywood works, so. That's interesting. Beads go back about 3,000 or 4,000 years. Yes, and they were made out of all kinds of things from fossils that would come out of rocks. There's a fossil animal called a crinoid. If you've ever seen rock which has little Cheerio-like fossils in it, that's part of a segmented crinoid stem. In some limestones, those will come out. You can cut up bird bone into little beads. So beads go back. Another thing that they used were porcupine quills. You soak those and you can stitch them in like you would do needlepoint. So actually that kind of decorative stuff goes way back. But again, when they got European trade beads, boom, their artwork with beads just exploded, you know, because we know a good thing when we see it, right? Yeah, you know. If I can have nice glass beads that already have a hole in it and come in 18 colors, yeah, I want that. You know?
Well, and I've read something about the change. You talk about changing technology. You know, they had to make their clay pots. Well, then white man comes and they have iron color. And that, you don't think about that as a technological change, but it is a difference in technology.
It's significant. So when Europeans introduced their material goods, native peoples, like I just said, went, oh, I want that. So I did my graduate work, excavations in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. And it was on 4,000-year-old sites. But as I was reading about the lives there, I would read the Jesuit Relations, which is out of Quebec. The Jesuits talking about what was going on in 1610, 1612, St. Lawrence Seaway. And one of the things that they said very explicitly after 1612, when they didn't see trade ships for 3 years because of bad weather and bad politics in Europe, they wrote vociferously back to Europe, you can't let the trade ships fail because native people starve. They gave up napping and pottery manufacture for European goods, and if you don't send them, they're the first to suffer. So it was a huge deal. And yet with all of those technological changes, the upheavals of a new people invading your land, and disease, you know, so from 1492 to the time we get to 1640, 150 years, disease had swept across North America, killing 90% of everybody here. And there's probably 40 to 60 million people, so that's leaving you with about 600,000. Now, disease didn't kill everyone everywhere all at the same time, etc. But how would you sustain your population? How would you keep enough elderly who knew ritual and philosophical ways to keep that alive? It would be devastating, you know? My dad gave me an example when I was a kid, because of course we all had to hide under our desks during the bomb, you know, nuclear bomb days. He was talking to me one day and he says, I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, 100,000 people. He says, think about it, you wipe out 10% of the people in Duluth. So you wipe out the police chief, the head of the waterworks, the streets department, the mayor, you know, those are part of the 10% that's gone. you may have huge failures in your society because those were critical people for operating infrastructure. And we're talking 90% of Native Americans died within that 150 years. You know, and yet here they are, they're vibrant, they're energetic, they're everywhere. Yeah, it's quite amazing. Yeah.
When you say the big share, like the land Indians that live there, you want to talk to them and see some more history?
Yes, Iowa has had a Native American Council active since I think about when the burial laws kicked in. Yeah, when I worked at Anthon on that Onota site, I had tribal monitors every day. Every day. And it was a thrill for me to work with native peoples. Many of our reports, depending on what the archaeology is that we find, we send those to the tribal council so that they can be aware and let their groups know. There are 26 different tribal nations that consider Iowa to be part of their ancestry. So we have a really dynamic and active Native American group working with us. And just overall, I know you guys all know if you're Native Iowans, people play well here. It's really nice to be here. You know, I've worked in other states. It's not very nice sometimes. You know, no offense, South Dakota. Anyway, okay. It's just not. So, yeah, it's good to work here, and it's great talking to all of you. Thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate it.